All rise, please. Welcome to day 4 of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. There is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm goes off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival at the muster point, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and who will be keeping a register of all attendees. The fire marshals will also be responsible for letting everyone know when it is safe to return in liaison with representatives from the Thistle Hotel. I now hand over to the chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start today's proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. Those at the back will know what I'm about to say. Apologies, but it's necessary. You may use any mobile electronic device that you have to transmit silently to the outside world what you have seen and heard in the inquiry, but only 10 minutes after the event that you are describing. 10 minutes must elapse before you do it. You may not use such a device for recording our proceedings or for taking photographs. Thank you. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, sir. This morning I'll be summarising the evidence of HN 2401 Anthony John Greenslade. Anthony Greenslade assisted the SDS as Detective Inspector during a period of about 6 months from the summer of 1973 to the end of the year. He provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 27th of July 2021, which may be summarised as follows. Anthony Greenslade joined the Metropolitan Police Service as a cadet in 1954, becoming a full constable in 1957. He joined Special Branch in 1960 and undertook various postings, including in C Squad, Ports, and the section concerned with Black Power. In 1971, he joined the Bomb Squad, conducting surveillance and inquiry into the actions of the Angry Brigade. It was during this posting that he also became involved with the SDS. He states that he did not consider himself in the SDS. He was formerly on the Bomb Squad, and he confirms that he continued that work throughout his time assisting the SDS. He notes that he was running surveillance in the Bomb Squad with DI Derek Brice, who was at the time also involved in managing the SDS, and he believes that he was brought in on Brice's recommendation. Anthony Greenslade supported the squad in an administrative capacity and was one of 3 detective inspectors serving in management positions for the SDS at the time. He had had no previous contact with the SDS and only knew about it vaguely before becoming involved. He confirms that he had not previously done any undercover policing and did not receive any training for the role. Anthony Greenslade indicates that he was put onto the SDS by Chief Superintendent Rollo Watts in order to help in the purchase of 12 cars to be used by undercover officers. Prior to this period, the SDS had been renting a small number of vehicles for general SDS use, something which Greenslade notes had been, quote, a bad experience. He states that he was also tasked to run promotion classes for members of the SDS, as there had been a bad record of promotional exam success in the squad. Greenslade did not have experience in training officers in promotion exams prior to this, and states that he does not know why he was picked for this role. He ran weekly sessions of 3 to 4 hours at the SDS Safe House. 6 officers chose to take part in these sessions, and Greenslade recalls that 3 of the 6 were ultimately successful. He notes that, quote, morale was low at the time, and I was put on to try and improve morale. Greenslade cannot recall now how he knew morale was low or what the cause of it was, but confirms that this was a known issue. He recalls other individuals being put on the SDS to help address the problem at the same time. Anthony Greenslade was involved in finding a second safe house for the SDS. He states that his involvement was, quote, by accident, due to the fact that HN 294 was unwell at the time, and Derek Brice was preparing to leave. He did not have a role in recruiting officers, though accepts that he may have recommended one individual who he had previously managed. He states that he believes officers were recruited, quote, randomly, with no set procedure. The process would have been largely under the control of HN 294, an individual who Greenslade describes as the, quote, kingpin of the SDS. He recalls that HN 294, quote, virtually ran the SDS as a fiefdom. I do not think he was very good at management. Anthony Greenslade confirms that he was not involved in training or tasking members of the SDS, choosing targets, developing cover identities, or anything to do with intelligence reporting, exfiltration, pay, or overtime. He states that he had no role in liaising with the security service or any other outside body. Anthony Greenslade states that he was not involved in the management of SDS officers, but maintained contact with them through the promotion classes. He also recalls playing cricket with the officers a couple of times as a group. Greenslade states that he had a desk in Scotland Yard with the bomb squad and would attend the SDS flat, but never worked from the SDS office in Scotland Yard. He remembers Commander Matt Roger visiting the SDS flat, socializing with the undercover officers and offering support. He does not remember how often this occurred. He did not have any role in compiling the SDS annual reports. He states that he did not know why specific groups were targeted, but expects that the decisions were largely made by HN 294 in consultation with the Chief Superintendent of C Squad. He cannot comment on how successful the infiltrations were or how they may have contributed to policing or assisted the security service, as he was not involved in the intelligence side of things. Greenslade states that he does not know whether prior permission was required for undercover officers to assume positions of responsibility within their groups, or whether any guidance was given on the issue. He was also unaware of the use of deceased children's identities. He confirms that he did not give any guidance or have any informal discussions with UCOs about sexual relationships in their cover identities. He states that his attitude to this issue was that any sexual activity between undercover officers and civilians would have been unacceptable. To his knowledge, none of his contemporaries provoked or encouraged a third party to commit a criminal offense, engaged in sexual activity whilst in their cover identity, were arrested, tried, or convicted in their cover identity, were involved in incidents of public order, crime, or violence, reported on any legally privileged information, or reported on the activities of elected politicians. He confirms that he did not give any officer orders, instructions, advice, or guidance in relation to any of these issues. When asked to comment on a report concerning personal details about an individual, Anthony Greenslade notes that, quote, "This is the sort of report Special Branch was always creating. It is a normal Special Branch report into the background of a person with potential extremist activity. I'm not aware of any guidance by the SDS as to the level of personal detail which was considered helpful to the reader of the report, but there would not need to be, because it was standard within Special Branch. Everyone would have had the experience of what to do." When asked about reporting on trade unions, Anthony Greenslade states that such information would have been reported because Special Branch or the Security Service would have been concerned about disruption to the economy. In terms of the contribution made to policing, Greenslade states, quote, "The SDS provided advance warning of demonstrations. That was the whole purpose of it. I suppose the SDS assisted the Security Service in identifying extremists and plans for possible disruption." He notes that overtime payments were a substantial part of officer pay on the SDS, and recalls that HN 155, cover name Phil Cooper, was the highest paid detective sergeant in the MPS at the time because of overtime. Despite this, Greenslade did not get the impression that this overtime influenced officers to stay on the unit longer than they might, or influenced them to paint an overly optimistic picture of what they were achieving. Anthony Greenslade retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1987 at the rank of Detective Chief Superintendent. He concludes his witness statement by observing that, quote, "The only matter I wish to add is that I disagreed fundamentally with the principle of undercover policing. It was damaging to individuals. Many suffered from the work, and some left the police afterwards. I think some people are psychologically unsuited to that sort of work, as I am." So that concludes the summary for Anthony Greenslade.
Thank you.
Documents related to that officer will be published by the inquiry today, as well as documents related to 4 other individuals involved with the SDS. They are HN294, who is deceased, who was Detective Sergeant in the SDS from January 1969, and Detective Inspector from March 1970, and finally, Detective Chief Inspector from November 1972 to March 1974. We will also be publishing the documents of HN332, where no statement has been sought due to ill health. He was Detective Inspector in the SDS from July 1968 to mid-1969, and head of the SDS between September 1971 to February 1972. HN819 Derek Neal, who is deceased, who was head of the SDS between March 1974 and April 1976. And finally, HN357 David Bicknell, where no statement has been sought due to ill health, who was Superintendent of the SDS from July 1974 to July 1975, and then Chief Superintendent from August 1976 to early 1977. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We'll rise now for 10 minutes to enable the screen to be set up for our next witness.
All rise, please.
Mr. Brice,
Good morning, sir.
good morning. I understand you wish to be sworn.
Thank you.
Mr. Fernandez will do the necessary.
Thank you. Mr. Brice, please place your Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear,
I swear
by Almighty God,
by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Brice, I understand that you would like to give your evidence in 40-minute stretches with a quarter of an hour's break in between.
If that's convenient, sir.
Of course
yes.
it is. No,
Thank you.
I hope this isn't going to be proof of one of Parkinson's laws that work expands to fill the time available, but we have plenty of time to accommodate your wish.
Thank you.
Ms. Faith.
Thank you, sir. Can you confirm your full name, please?
Derek William Fred Brice.
And Mr. Brice, it's right that you made a witness statement to the inquiry dated 15th of September 2021.
Yes.
Have you had the opportunity to read the statement before giving evidence today?
Oh, yes, before, yes, not today, but before today, yes.
Yes, thank you. Can you confirm, please, that the contents are true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
May we start briefly with your background in the Metropolitan Police Force? It's right that you joined as a 19-year-old senior cadet in late 1957.
Yes.
And at that point, as all officers do, you had 13 weeks training at Hendon.
Yes.
Following that, at the earliest opportunity, 2 years on, you joined Special Branch.
I did.
And you remained in Special Branch, performing a variety of roles for approximately 14 years before you left the police force in October 1974.
That's correct.
When you left, it's right, you were in the rank of Detective Inspector, having been in that rank since 1971.
That's correct.
Can I please deal in a global sense, if you like, of that time that you were in the Metropolitan Police Force with the training that you received? You've confirmed the initial training at Hendon. Do you recall whether you received any additional training when you joined Special Branch?
No, I can't recall any specific training, no.
So if I were to ask you whether you have any recollection of a 2-week course, that doesn't come to mind to you?
It doesn't come to mind.
When you joined the SDS, in and around that time, you completed, is it right, a 4-month course at Bramshill?
Could you ask me that question again, please?
Do you recall completing a course at Bramshill in late 1973?
Yes, I do.
A few more questions, please, if I may, on training. Whilst you're in the police force, do you recall training being given to you on the legal limits of police powers?
I can't remember.
I'll see if I can help in this way. Were you aware of the limits on a police officer's powers of entry, search and seizure?
Yes.
Were you given any instruction at any stage about whether those powers or limitations on those powers were the same when you or an officer was acting in an undercover role?
I can't remember, sorry.
Does it follow with whether you ever addressed your mind when you joined the STS as to whether the limitations on those powers were the same or different?
I have no comment to make on that, I'm sorry.
Perhaps I can use an example that may assist. In your witness statement, you refer to a force memorandum being circulated on 2 occasions during your service on the subject of agent provocateur. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Are you able to help with whether that was during your time in Special Branch, on the SDS, or both?
Well, it was in my time in Special Branch. I don't know whether it was during my time on SDS.
Is there any reason that you recall that particular piece of guidance?
No.
Do you have any recollection of other police orders being issued in the same way, by way of a circular?
I think there may have been the police order issued sometime about agent provocateur.
If we can have up document, please, MPS-0727104. Mr. Brice, I hope that will come up on a screen that you have.
Which one?
Are you able to see that document, Mr. Brice?
Yes, I can, yes.
You'll see that that's a Home Office circular dated May 1969 regarding informants who take part in crime. If we can scroll down, please, to the second page. Actually, remaining where you were, sorry, the first page. There, Mr. Brice, and I'll read it out if it helps, at paragraph 3, A, it states, no member of a police force and no police informant should counsel, incite or procure the commission of a crime. Do you have any recollection whether that is the memorandum that you received when you were in Special Branch?
I've never seen that memorandum before. I was offered it as a piece of exhibit.
Does what's recorded there fit with your recollection of what you received in relation to agent provocateur?
Yes, I think that the piece that you read out to me, of course, rings a bell, yes.
Thank you. A couple more questions on training and then we'll move on. During your service in the police force, did you have in mind that you needed to police in a way which would maintain the respect of the public and the public's approval of your actions?
Yes.
And did you maintain that view whilst you were on the SDS?
Well, I would have tried to, yes.
Similarly, what about police disciplinary regulations? Do you recall having knowledge of those? Well, of course, yes. I was aware of police discipline regulations, of what we could and should do. And that's about as far as I can recall. Thank you, Mr. Brice. I realise I'm asking you to turn your mind back some years. I'd like to move, please, to C Squad and your experience there. Is this fair to say from your witness statement that early on in your police career you were on C Squad, you went off to do other work and then you returned to C Squad, and that was a pattern that you followed?
Yes.
And you returned to C Squad in 1971, now as Detective Inspector, and remained there until the Bomb Squad was formed the following year. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that to be true, yes.
Mr. Brice, you refer to returning to CO. Was that the central office?
Yes, the Commissioner's office, yes.
Commissioner's office, forgive me.
Yes.
Was that based at Scotland Yard?
Yes.
Whilst you were on C Squad, it's right that you dealt with left-wing groups. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you help a little, please, as to what your role entailed in that regard in C Squad?
I would have been supervising the inquiries probably of the DCs and the sergeants.
And you said that you don't recall any particular training in Special Branch. How did you come to understand what sort of information the squad wanted?
I think we would have gained that knowledge from learning, as it were, on the job, as it were, being passed down.
Are you able to help us, please, with how material was collected and retained on C Squad?
I can't really remember now.
Now, we'll come on to the SDS in a short while. You said in your witness statement that you had no contact with that squad before becoming involved in it. Whether or not it came from the SDS, were you aware of intelligence coming in from other sources to the assistance of C Squad?
I wasn't aware, no.
And was that throughout your time on C Squad? And I'm focusing particularly, please, on your final stint when you came back in 1971 to C Squad. Do you recall any other intelligence coming in to assist?
I can't recall anything, no.
Perhaps you've already answered this, but let me ask this. Were you aware of any intelligence or information coming in for onward dissemination, for example, to A8, public order?
Yes, I would have been aware that information that was gathered would be passed to them because they were in charge of public order, but that's all I remember.
And is that from your knowledge or an assumption that it would go on to them?
I think it's an assumption that they would have received the information that was available for them.
Whilst you were working on C Squad, or indeed anywhere else in Special Branch, did you ever pass requests for intelligence to other units?
No.
The second element of the work on C Squad that you refer to in your statement is inquiries for the security service.
Yeah.
Were those inquiries related to groups and individuals that the security service were interested in?
Well, they could have been groups or individuals.
And was the interest, to your understanding, of potentially subversive groups and individuals, or was it a different reason?
I can only assume that it was because they were of a subversive element.
Were you given any training or guidance on what subversion meant at that time?
I can't recall.
Inquiries for the security service, were any of those relating to vetting?
I can't recall that either.
Final question relating to C Squad. You said that you were a supervisor of some of the officers. Can you give an idea, please, of how the squad was supervised and managed during your time?
It's so long ago, I have a problem in remembering that. I'm sorry.
Okay. I appreciate I'm asking you to turn your mind back a considerable amount of time. Before we move to the SDS, please, you moved in 1972 to the bomb squad, and there you were also a senior officer on the surveillance unit. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said that the head of the bomb squad was Comrade Dixon. Were
yes,
you...
He was one of, yes.
Sorry, continue, please.
He was one of the senior officers, yes.
Were you aware that he was the former head of the SDS or of a covert unit?
No, I wasn't.
Did he give you any training or ethos on the performance of a covert role?
No.
Let's move now, please, to the SDS. I'd like to begin with clarifying, if we can, your start date. Your initial recollection when you were asked to make a witness statement for this inquiry was that you'd been on the unit for approximately 20 months. We know that you left the SDS and the police force in October 1974, so that would have put your starting date on the SDS in and around February or March 1973. So it's right, that was your initial recollection, I think, Mr. Brice.
Yes.
Now, it seems, perhaps on receiving the bundle of documents from the inquiry for your witness statement, you then thought your initial recollection was perhaps incorrect. I'm going to suggest to you that your memory on that, your recollection, was in fact the right one, that you came onto the SDS in and around February or March 1973. Given the time that you've had to reflect since providing your statement, would you now agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Dealing, please, with your recruitment to the SDS. I want to clarify, please, something that you put in your statement at paragraph 14. It doesn't necessarily need to be brought up at the moment. What you said there was that you asked the Federation rep what special branch was before going into it, and he said nobody talks about it. Did you mean there you asked about what the SDS was rather than the special branch?
No, when I asked that question, I was a PC, aged 20, when there was an application for members to join special branch, and I asked an old PC what they were, and he said nobody talks about it, so I joined.
So in fact, what's in your statement is correct, that the response nobody talks about it was in relation to special branch rather than to the SDS itself.
Well, I think both in some senses, yes. I didn't know.
Okay.
I had no, I didn't apply to join SDS. Whether you can say I was invited or not, I'm not sure, but that's where I ended up.
Once you joined the SDS, did that closed approach remain? Were you able to talk freely, certainly amongst members of the SDS and the more senior managers, about what was happening in the squad?
I can't really answer that question, I'm afraid. I don't recall.
Do you recall whether you were told when you were moving to the SDS to keep it a secret?
Well, no, I wasn't told it was a secret, but I think we just left it at that, really.
Okay. Now, you've touched on whether or not you were invited. You didn't apply to join the SDS. In your witness statement, your recollection is that you, in fact, didn't formally join the SDS, but sometimes you would be back doing bomb squad work. Is that correct?
Well, the time is so long ago, and I'm probably still a bit confused about what I was doing from time to time. But I'm okay with those dates you gave me earlier on.
I wonder, please, if we can look at a document. It may or may not assist. Can we have first, please, MPS-0737402. So that's tab 15 of your bundle, I believe. Now, this is a fairly difficult document to read, Mr. Brice, as seems to trouble us with the documents. It is an organisational chart of Metropolitan Special Branch and the C Squad.
Yes.
It is dated, albeit there's no date on this particular document, we understand July 1973. If I can ask you please to look in the middle and at the bottom of the document, can you see there, sitting under a chief inspector, which reads HN 324, there is the special demo, as it says, and your name is in the second of those 4 boxes.
Yes.
Now, I don't know whether this helps you or not as to whether your recollection that you weren't really on the squad is correct. It certainly seems as though you are placed on that organisational chart as an inspector in the Special Demonstration Squad.
I can accept that now, yes.
Whilst we have this document on the screen, I'd just like to ask you a couple of supplementary questions, please, about C Squad. Could you look to the far left of that page and you'll see a box that says SEC Service Inspector.
Yes.
We think that may refer to Security Service Inspector. Are you able to give us any help on what that role was?
I'm afraid it means nothing to me.
Another rather tricky question in numbers, please. Can you recall approximately how many officers there were in C Squad ranked either sergeant or constable?
Above sergeant or constable?
Of either the rank of sergeant or constable.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. If we can take that document down, please. Are you able to recall whether there were any lengthy periods of time after you joined the SDS when you were off that squad and doing other work?
I can't recall.
In your witness statement, you make reference to the connection of you moving over from the bomb squad / surveillance unit to the SDS was perhaps a relationship between those two squads. And just a yes or no answer, please. Were you aware of the two units being jointly supervised?
No.
Remaining on that connection for a moment, is it a fair assessment to say that there was no interview, no formal process for joining, but it was perhaps more of a word of mouth based on recommendation or reputation that officers moved over to the SDS?
I can't answer that really, thank you.
Let's just see for a moment if this helps. Do you recall Anthony Greenslade, another detective inspector?
Yes.
He was on the surveillance unit with you, is that correct?
Yes.
And for a period of time, he was on the SDS as well. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And in fact, I think he was brought on a couple of months after you joined. He came over in the summer of 1973. He suggests that he thinks he was probably brought onto the unit at your recommendation. Do you recall whether you did recommend him?
It's possible, I don't recall.
An officer we're hearing from tomorrow, HN 34 Geoffrey Craft, in his witness statement, considers that he may have been brought onto the SDS as a result of you having a word with the senior managers. I think he came on at the end of your tenure. Does that ring true with your memory?
No, I don't recall that.
The comment that he makes in his witness statement is that the special branch was a comparatively small place and everyone knew everyone else. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes.
Another officer in the final of this recruitment phase is HN 368 Richard Walker, a junior manager that joined once you were leaving. He states that he was asked to join by you. You'd known each other from a police station years earlier. Do you have any recollection of that?
I don't recall that, but it's a possibility.
If and when you were recommending management level officers come over to the SDS, what characteristics or personalities did you consider might work well on the squad that were important?
I think they'd have to be officers that would have a caring approach to the officers that they were supervising.
Can we turn, please, to the handover and or any training that you received as a detective inspector on the SDS? It's fair to say, isn't it, that by the time you joined, you were an officer of considerable experience in intelligence gathering, surveillance, and the like.
I'm not sure I would say it that way, but if that's what somebody has said, well, I must accept it.
Well, did you feel equipped from your time on C Squad and other areas of Special Branch for 14 years that you had an idea of what the branch were interested in?
Yes.
And did that influence at all how you expected the SDS to operate?
No, not really.
And I think it's right, isn't it, that you say for all the experience that you had gained, you'd never performed a role in undercover work before moving to the SDS.
I had not performed undercover work.
And in fact, you yourself didn't perform any undercover work whilst you were on the SDS.
That's correct.
Now, you've made it clear in your statement there was no formal training when you moved over. Does it follow that you weren't provided with any documents or written guidance when you joined the SDS?
I can't recall ever receiving it.
Do you recall ever seeing a black loose-leaf folder that was available to the undercover officers?
No.
What you do say is this, right, Mr. Brice, that of course you discussed how things were done when you joined.
Probably.
Do you recall that the chief inspector on the unit was HN 294? And you may wish to look at the document you have there.
Yes.
The detective sergeant, do you recall, was Dave Smith?
Yes.
And certainly at the time of you joining, there wasn't a dedicated superintendent, is that right?
Yes, I can't remember that.
And we've spoken about Anthony Greenslade, that for a short period he was a member of this management team.
Yes.
Do you recall, please, any discussion with HN 294 as your immediate superior about the purpose of the SDS?
No.
In your witness statement, you say that essentially the purpose boils down to, or the justification of why we were doing it in the first place. And you make reference to the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the demonstrations in 1968. did you discuss with HN294 why the unit was still operating in 1973?
No.
At that point in joining, in early 1973, did you gain an understanding about what the remit was of the SDS, of what they were interested in?
Gradually, by talking to the officers, yes.
And does it follow then that any information that you gleaned on which groups were considered to pose a threat, which groups that you were interested in, was from being on the job rather than HN294 as your chief inspector informing you of how deployments and why deployments were as they were?
I would say it's more likely I learn on the job.
We've touched briefly on A8 in relation to C Squad. In your witness statement, you refer to perhaps an assumption. You say that the information, the public order purpose was of interest to A8, and you assume information went to them from the SDS. Is that right?
I assume it did.
Okay. But does it follow that you're not able to help with how and when the intelligence was disseminated to that unit, to A8?
That information would have been disseminated and decided upon at a level higher than me.
Would that be a level higher but still within the management team of the SDS, for example, the chief inspector, or higher than that rank?
Probably higher than that.
Can I ask you this? When you're discussing public order purposes in your witness statement, and this is at paragraph 100, you state some organisations were pacifists and caused no problems. Is that something you came to learn on the job on the SDS?
I can't say, I'm afraid.
If you did come to that understanding whilst you were the detective inspector on the SDS, would you seek to review a deployment of that particular undercover officer for its justification?
I'm not sure I can answer that either, I'm afraid.
A couple more questions to finish this topic, Mr. Brice, and then I think we are about time for our break. Did you have any understanding that there was a direct relationship between the SDS and C Squad?
Because the boss, I think that chart you showed me earlier, the boss of the whole thing was in charge of everything on C Squad, which included that little box at the bottom where my name was.
Okay. And I think it's right at this time that you were all on the same corridor in the same building at Scotland Yard.
Yes, I'm sure we were, yes.
Do you recall whether there was regular and open dialogue between, if you were in your office and there was a manager of C Squad in his or her office, that there would be discussion?
Well, I don't recall any particular instances, but there would be an opportunity if one wanted it.
I just want to deal, please, finally before the break, with the role of the SDS in relation to the security service. Did you have any understanding that there was a relationship between the SDS and the security service?
No.
You were provided with a document in the preparation of your witness statement which related to a meeting in January 1974 where you attended along with HN294 at the security service. Now, it's fair you say you have no recollection of that meeting.
Yes, I have no recollection of it, but I accept because I've seen the document.
I just want to spend a few minutes on what HN294 recorded of that meeting in case it assists at all with the relationship. I wonder, please, if we can have document MPS-0735753 and starting at page 3. So this is tab 7 of the bundle. Mr. Brice, I'm going to read some parts of that to you, and I'm starting at paragraph 2. This is a memorandum of HN294, your chief inspector at the time, dated the 15th of January 1974. He records in the document at paragraph 2 that the meeting that you and he attended was to acquaint you with the intentions of the security service to form a new section. And it was a section to deal with extremist politics to the left of the Communist Party. And he goes on to say that in his assessment, the security service wanted to ascertain 2 things, and this is at paragraph 3. The first is whether the SDS would be making their experience available to the security service. And the second was the attitude of the police if they were to come into conflict with the law as an accessory to an offence. Moving to page 4, the response that HN294 records that was given at that meeting was that yes, the SDS would assist the security service and information would be freely available, and 2, that SDS officers were precluded by the Home Office instructions from any action likely to invite an accusation of their being agent provocateurs. That document can be taken down now, thank you. Mr. Brice, do you recall in January 1974 any discussion within the unit of the relationship with the security service and the new section that was being formed?
None at all.
Okay. So if that's a convenient time for a break.
Certainly. We'll have a quarter of an hour break and we'll be ready to resume at the end of a quarter of an hour.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All rise, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Brice, I want to deal, please, with your role as Detective Inspector at the SDS now. That was one that was primarily supervising officers, looking after their safety and their needs. Is that correct?
Yes, I would describe it as a welfare officer in a sense, yes.
And I think in your statement you say it's akin to a quartermaster in the army.
Yes.
Given that was your role, and I appreciate you've said that to your recollection the learning was really on the job rather than by way of a handover, I want to spend a few moments more looking at some specific areas of that exercising that supervisory function before we deal with the day-to-day interaction with the undercover officers. The first area, please, is compromise, potential compromise of the undercover officers. Immediately before or at around the time that you joined the SDS, 3 officers were unexpectedly withdrawn from the field. Without going into any detail, do you have any recollection of a quarter of the squad being unexpectedly withdrawn?
No, I don't have no recollection at all.
I'll give you their nominals if you'd like to look at the document you've had, just in case that jogs your memory. The first is HN 45.
Right.
And then a female officer, HN 348.
Yes.
And a third officer, and I can give you her name, it's Jill Mosdell. They, as I say, were all withdrawn unexpectedly, and in fact it was an incident that was then referenced in the annual report of that year. Is your recollection that your superior, HN 294, made no mention of that when you came on to the squad?
I was not aware of that, and I didn't recall the last 2 people being around when I joined.
Again, without going into details, please, once you were in your day-to-day life as the detective inspector on the unit, did you hear or engage in conversations with the undercover officers about the loss of those 3 officers?
No.
Targets and tasking, please. How were you going to approach your daily supervisory role, the welfare role, in the absence of any information about what your officers were doing, which groups that they were infiltrating?
Their job was very much one based upon trust that they were doing the job that they were supposed to do. And I saw them frequently.
Did you understand it to be any part of your role to conduct a review of their deployments?
On the basis of being a supervisory officer, yes. But it was very difficult because you're not doing their job to actually make worthwhile comments.
And did you, and we'll come on to the meetings at the Safe House, but did you keep at the forefront of your mind that you needed to have this appraisal of whether the groups that they were infiltrating were causing an issue with public order?
When you talked about appraisal, I thought you were talking about the appraisal of the officer concerned, not the organisations. I didn't have any, I can't recollect anything about the organisations themselves.
So just to clarify that, Mr. Brice, when you say that really it was on trust, but you had to keep on top of what your officers were doing, was that in relation to assessing the officers rather than making an assessment of the groups that they were infiltrating?
Yes, I think that's true.
What about the officers would you be assessing?
Well, I mean, one way would be, did they ever put any intelligence work before into the office, as it were?
And so would you be able to monitor that when you attended the bi-weekly meetings at the Safe House?
Only that you were the messenger or the carrier of possible notes or something being brought forward for the back office. I couldn't vouch for that, for the authenticity of the information, no.
So if an officer were handing nothing or very little in, would that cause you to speak to the officer as to whether there was a problem?
Well, it might do, but I can't be specific about that now.
Okay. We'll come back when we move to the Safe House to any assessment of reporting. Positions of responsibility I'd like to speak to you about. This is something in your witness statement that you say there was no SDS policy, to your knowledge, against undercover officers taking up positions of responsibility, and they didn't need to seek permission before they did so. Is that correct?
That's correct. I wasn't aware of that.
How did you come to that understanding, or was it simply the absence of anything to the contrary?
I think it was the absence of it. I can't remember.
In light of the memorandum that you do recall getting on agent provocateur, did you seek any guidance from your chief inspector as to whether it was appropriate for an officer to take a leading role in a group?
No.
Did you form any view in your own mind as to whether that would be appropriate?
I can't recall forming any opinion.
I'd like to ask you, please, about HN 353.
Yes.
That is an officer that you do recall being in the SDS at the same time as yourself. And in fact, we will come back to HN 353. He was an officer recruited and in the back office during your tenure in spring 1974. He, in his witness statement, has told the inquiry that he was advised never to take an organisational role, and that was by a manager in the back office. Do you recall that being you?
No, I don't.
And it's right that at this time, the management team was made up in the back office of yourself and Dave Smith. Is that right?
Yes.
Can we move on, please, to arrest of undercover officers? When you joined, HN 298 was a member of the squad.
Yes.
About a year before you joined, HN 298 had been arrested and subsequently prosecuted and convicted in his cover name, and that is the name of Mike Scott. That had been managed by your Chief Inspector HN 294 and Commander Roger as head of the C Squad. And he, the decision had been taken for him to engage in that matter and be convicted in his cover name. Is that something that was brought to your attention of how an officer may be dealt with if he was arrested?
No.
Do you recall having any type of conversation with any of the undercover officers about their knowledge of what happened with HN 298?
No.
Mr. Brice, we heard yesterday from Dave Smith, and he said that in the back office there was yourself and him and your chief inspector, and it was a case of you being together there, and if a problem arose, you would perhaps discuss it and ask one another. Does that accord with your recollection of how things were done?
I think that's a reasonable thing to say, yes. I don't recollect any particular incidents, but not all this time later, but that's a reasonable statement to make.
And is that your recollection, that it was that sort of reactive approach to any issues rather than having guidance and a clear path of how you were going to manage the unit?
I'm not sure I can comment on that, really.
Perhaps let me ask it in this way. When you went to the back office, went to go and look after the welfare of your officers, did you have any clear policy or guidance in your mind in terms of compromise, arrest, positions of responsibility, of how you would guide and supervise them?
I saw them on a twice-weekly basis, and so I would like to feel that any issues would have been brought to my attention, which is why I say it was very much like a welfare function or role.
Outside of you performing the welfare role, it's right that as and when needed, you stood in as head of the unit, as acting chief inspector, didn't you?
Yes.
And it's right that that was a role you took on from time to time throughout your tenure, from February, March 1973 up to leaving in October 1974. Is that right?
Yes.
Did the absence of any firm policy on being head of the unit and how you would deal with the officers cause you concern?
No.
And certainly until the mid part of 1974, would you agree that in the absence of a dedicated superintendent, if there was a problem and you were acting chief inspector, effectively the buck stopped with you? You were making the decisions.
Well, in any supervisory role, I think the point there is that had I have required further assistance, I would have gone to the next person up in rank, which would probably have been a chief superintendent.
And to your memory, would that be somebody who was on the same corridor at Scotland Yard?
Yes.
Okay. Before we move to those meetings, can I spend a moment, please, on the management style of HN 294? Anthony Greenslade, Anthony Greenslade, your colleague in the surveillance unit and then fellow detective inspector on the SDS, has described HN 294 as being the kingpin of the SDS and running it as a fiefdom. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I think it's a fair statement from Mr. Greenslade.
Was your assessment that HN 294 would keep his decision making to himself effectively rather than share the role with you?
Yes, this man is dead, but I think it's a fair statement.
Did at the time you feel that had any impact on your ability to perform your own role?
No.
Now, it was not just HN 294 who was your chief inspector. About a year into your service, he was replaced with Derek Neal as chief inspector. Do you recall that?
Well, I know Derek Neal, but I don't recall, as it were, being answerable to him when I was on the SDS. But it is possible.
So is your main memory of HN 294 in the chief inspector role?
Yes, and as you said earlier, I was often doing the acting role because he was, sadly, I think, a person who suffered from ill health, which is why I was acting.
Right, I think that you recall David Bicknell becoming the superintendent in and around the time that the SDS moved to the S squad. Do you remember him playing a role in the management?
Yes, he was the person that I would have been answerable to when I was acting chief inspector, yes.
Did that have any impact on how the SDS was run when David Bicknell came on board?
Well, he was an approachable senior officer, and therefore, obviously, life would be a little easier. He was there if we wanted him.
Do I take it from that, Mr. Brice, that you're drawing a comparison with how approachable or not HN 294 was?
Possibly, yes. Some people are more approachable than others.
Before we have our next break, and we've still got some time, let's have a little look at your day-to-day role, please. I want to ask you about procurement of vehicles. When you joined in February, March 1973, did each undercover officer have their own vehicle?
I'm not sure everyone each had one, but I can't really be any more certain than that.
Were you aware that until early 73, there was a pool of only 3 to 4 vehicles that were hire vehicles that the operational officers shared?
Yes, I think that's highly likely.
So it's highly likely, but it's something that wasn't in your direct knowledge, is that?
Well, I say that because I wasn't aware that I had many vehicles to look after. If they were hired ones, it wouldn't have been down to me. Yeah.
Okay. I want to move, please, to the back office where you were your chief inspector and HM 103 David Smith. If there were any new recruits to the SDS, such as officers who were going to be deployed in the future, it's right, is it, that they would also spend time in the back office?
Yes, I think that's probably right. I can't recall any individual, but I think that's right.
And once an officer, I think this is what your evidence is in your witness statement, once an officer had been asked to join the SDS, effectively they were then yours to look after.
Not while they were doing their stint in the office.
But you would see them on a day-to-day basis in the office.
If I was in the office, yes, but very often I was not in the office.
And when you weren't in the office, it's right that twice a week you were at the safe house at the meetings.
Yes.
And for the remainder of the time, was this a case if you worked Monday to Friday in this role?
Yes.
If you weren't at the safe house meetings, would you be in the back office?
More than likely.
Let's deal, please, with new recruits. The officer that you do recall joining during your tenure is HN 300. I don't know if you'd like to remind yourself of the name.
Yes.
In fact, other officers, in addition to HN 300, were also recruited and spent time in the back office in about the middle of your service there. HN 353 was one, and that's an officer that I think you do recall in your witness statement.
Yes.
That officer came into the back office in spring 74 and appears to have been reporting by about June of that year. Do you recall that officer in the back office?
No.
HN 351 was another, and to be fair, Mr. Brice, in your witness statement, you do say you don't recall.
I don't recall him.
What about HN 200?
Yes, I recognise him.
And he was an officer that came into the squad in about April 74. And do you recall this? He remained in the back office until the end of your tenure, essentially, till October of that year.
I'm not absolutely sure of that. I thought he would have gone from out of the back office while I was still serving, but I can't be certain.
And HN 297, and I can give you his actual name, it's Richard Clark.
Yes.
He joined you in summer of 1974. Do you remember him?
I don't remember him at all. I know who it is, but I don't remember him in my time in SDS.
We'll come back on to your memory of him in a little while, so we will come back to Richard Clark. These officers that were in the back office, so to your memory, you do remember HN 300 and HN 200.
Yes.
But all of the officers that I've mentioned to you used the identity of a deceased child.
Sorry, can you ask me that again?
The officers that we've just spoken about, all joining in the middle, if you like, of your tenure, all used the identity of a deceased child. Do you recall that?
No, I'm not aware of that.
I just want to explore for a few moments, please. You said in your witness statement that when the officers came to you, they had a cover identity. What the officers have described, either in their witness statements or in oral evidence, is that once on the SDS and in the back office, they would develop their cover identity. Let's look at an example, perhaps. HN 353, who we've spoken about, that you recall.
Yes.
He, in his witness statement, said he was told to go to Somerset House to obtain the details to develop his cover identity. Did you tell him to do that?
Certainly not.
HN 200, who you recall, challenged the instruction.
Yes?
HN 200 challenged the instruction to use a deceased child's identity as it didn't sit comfortably with him. And that led to a discussion about why he needed a birth certificate. And that was during his time in the back office. Do you recall a conversation with him of that nature?
No.
Do you recall overhearing any such conversation?
No.
David Bicknell, who you say was your superintendent for a period, addresses the use of such identities. In a witness statement given some years ago to Operation Hearn in 2015, he described at this time with these officers that it was a practical solution to a problem that the SDS was facing in creating plausible identities. Did David Bicknell discuss the need for these identities with you as head of the unit at that time?
Never.
As acting chief inspector, did you give any consideration to the importance of knowing how robust or not your officers' identities were when they were going out into the field each day?
Not especially, no.
Mr. Brice, let's move on from that area, please, to training of these new recruits, and I'll take this shortly. The officers in their witness statements describe much of their learning was on the job, as I think you've described, and that collectively say that they would speak to deployed officers to get some information. Does that accord with how you understood them to be trained?
Yes, I think their ability to meet collectively, that was one of the advantages of it. They could pick each other's brains, really.
On the topic of picking brains, HN 200 has stated that he would
Yes.
That he would go to senior officers if he wanted to pick a person's brain as to how to go about his role. Do you recall interactions with him about how he should perform his day-to-day role?
I don't recall any reaction there, no, at all. Interaction.
HN 351, 353 and 200, who we've been speaking about, were all to infiltrate the International Socialists, then become known as the Socialist Workers' Party. Did you become aware, or were you involved in the decision to deploy those three officers into that group?
I was not involved in that deployment.
Let's start, if we may, dealing with the bi-weekly meetings. Is your recollection that there were two safe houses when you joined the SDS?
Possibly. I just think on that. I think at one point when I joined, there was only one.
Without going into details at this stage, did you come to understand why there was one and then there was an additional one, of why that happened?
I think it made sense to have an alternative, yes.
The meetings at the Safe House were described in the annual report for the year when you were in the SDS as having two purposes, essentially. One was an opportunity to discuss and identify problems and future targets, and the other was to afford an opportunity to assess the behaviour of operational officers, so that any pressures, operational or otherwise, could be diagnosed and remedied. Is that a fair assessment of the purpose that you understood them to be for?
Yeah, that's pretty fair.
You've described the undercover role as a gutsy job, which was awful to do and scary at times. Focusing on your time in the SDS, how did you come to form that opinion?
I think the whole nature of undercover work is you need a bit of guts to do it, and it can be risky, and it's only possible by certain people.
And you give the example in your witness statement that then it was important that the officers saw their contemporaries, shared some camaraderie together, and would it be fair to be able to be relaxed and to be free in talking to one another?
Yes.
Can you help, please, describe how a day would be run, or how the day would go when you went to one of the safe houses?
Oh, we would have met probably mid-morning. We would have somehow eaten together around the lunch period, and there was an opportunity then for either a one-to-one chat or meetings with smaller groups of people.
And having met mid-morning, would the meeting run for the remainder of the day?
Well, I think they would probably have finished round about 4 o'clock, because there may have been work to be done later on, because a lot of their work tended to be that sort of start of the day onwards.
Were you aware or involved if there wasn't anywhere the officers were going at around 4 o'clock? Might from time to time they socialise outside of the safe house?
Well, I didn't particularly socialise outside of the safe house. I'm not saying others didn't, I wouldn't know.
Let's spend a few moments up until the break to deal with the business side of things, if you like, at the meetings, and then we'll deal with welfare afterwards. You stated in your witness statement that some officers wrote down their intelligence at the meetings, and did others simply hand in a manuscript report to you?
Yeah.
Those that wrote their intelligence, their information down at the meeting, was there discussion about what might be included or excluded in what they wrote?
No, I would have collected, or whoever was with me collected, the information as it was offered.
Do you recall David Smith sometimes coming to those meetings?
Well, he might have done it. It wasn't his regular job, but I'm not saying he didn't turn up sometimes.
earlier in your evidence, you said one way of assessing the officers was by the quantity of reports that may come in. Are you able to help with the sort of volume of reporting that was coming in twice a week at the meetings?
No, I can't really.
I won't bring it up, but so for reference, the document is UCPI 501635. Mr. Brice, that is simply an intelligence report that you signed in August 1974 when you were acting Chief Inspector. And that's one example of when an intelligence report came across your desk. Do you recall from time to time signing intelligence reports?
Well, I have seen one or two in the document, but I can't recall them individually, of course, but it is a possibility, and there's one example.
And from that example, I'm not for now interested in the content. It's simply if it does to help your recollection. When that came to you to sign, would you read it first?
Yes.
Would you make any assessment of its contents?
No, I wouldn't necessarily be in a position to question its content, and therefore my job was to send it further up the line.
What was the purpose in reading it before you signed it?
Well, I think it would be wise to read it before you sign anything.
And so when you were reading it, if something jumped out at you, would you then take it up with the individual officer?
Well, if it was something particularly outrageous or something important, or I knew something which maybe wasn't true, then of course I would question it. But I don't recall any of that happening any time.
What sort of content would cause you to say, this is outrageous, I need to deal with it?
I can't think of something at the moment, I'm afraid.
Two examples before we break, if I may. HN 343 was an officer in the squad.
Oh, yeah.
Do you recall that officer?
Yes.
In his witness statement, his evidence is that he recalls conversations with yourself and the Chief Inspector, giving an update on the situation in his group, which was the International Socialists. Do you recall discussions with him specifically?
I don't recall those discussions, no.
HN 299/342, I'll just give you a chance to look at that officer's details.
Yes.
Do you recall that officer?
Yes.
In his witness statement, he recalls that on occasion at these meetings at the Safe House, he was asked to attend specific meetings or demonstrations, so given some direct tasking requests. Does that accord with your recollection?
Well, that is possible. I don't recall myself particularly detailing him to go to a particular place, but it's possible.
And finally, on this topic before the break, what you do say is that deployments would be discussed if an officer was having a sticky time. Could you help us, please, with what you meant by a sticky time?
I think, as we mentioned earlier, I tried to be aware that whether they were comfortable in the job they were doing. And I like to think that you would have been able to perhaps spot that. And there came a time, or there would come a time, when people might want not to continue doing the job they were doing. So in other words, I describe that as when things got a bit difficult in terms of maybe they were, I don't know, apprehensive about being exposed.
On that point, in case this assists you, HN343, who we discussed a moment ago,
Yes.
he described in his witness statement that he'd had enough of life as an undercover officer. As a single young man, being deployed made it difficult to have a personal life. And he spoke to management and was asked to come off the unit and found a supportive response in that. Is that an example of what you're referring to as a sticky time?
I think we can assume that's a reasonable comment to make, yes.
Do you recall having a conversation with that officer about his wish to leave?
I don't recall it.
Sorry, if that's a convenient point for our next break.
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Brice.
15-minute break, then your evidence will resume, and then we'll have a break for lunch, a rather longer than 15-minute break. Content with that? Good.
Thank you.
All rise, please.
Mr. Brice, before we move on to welfare, I just want to ask for clarification from one point in your witness statement. It's paragraph 29. You say that Detective Sergeant Smith and the Chief Inspector had a direct line of communication that excluded you as a supervisor. Can you just explain what you meant by that, please?
What I meant was that they sat in two adjacent desks in the same office.
Okay. So it was no more than that. It was simply that they were there and
That's
could
right.
discuss.
I didn't have a desk, so I didn't need one particularly. So they were side by side in the office.
Let's move on then, please, to welfare. And we're going to come back to this part of your statement in a moment. But you say that officers wouldn't necessarily tell their detective inspector everything. Does it follow from that that an important part of your supervisory and welfare role was to observe the officers carefully at the meetings and essentially to keep an ear to the ground as to what was happening?
Yes, that would be fair.
Without giving any names, what were the welfare concerns of the officers when you were attending the meetings?
I think as you indicated before the break, if people were feeling that they were fed up with that sort of life, I'd be looking for that sort of behaviour in their usual or unusual mannerisms, as the case may be, and then invite a situation where, do you want to talk about this? Because I think that was probably the most important thing of all.
Were there any other welfare concerns secondary to that?
Well, not that I can put my finger on at the moment. I think that was our main concern, that whether they felt in their own mind that they were safe, in inverts.
When Anthony Greenslade came on to the SDS in summer of 1973, his evidence in his witness statement is that one of the reasons for him coming on was that morale was low amongst the officers. Do you remember being the kind of atmosphere at the time?
No, I wasn't.
Did you have any concerns about the morale of your officers in?
Well, not that I can recall now, and I'm surprised to hear that statement now.
You've referred to sharing a meal together, having drinks and relaxing. Did that include alcoholic drinks in the afternoon?
No.
Did you ever consume any alcohol at the meetings?
I was not an encourager of alcoholic drinks, so no.
What about the officers, the undercover officers?
Well, it wasn't permitted during what I call the official meeting time in the safe house. We didn't have alcohol. When we broke up, and you asked me this before, what happened after that when I had no control over?
Is that the period you say when the meeting came to an end at about 4 o'clock?
And then we went on our separate ways, yes.
Right. Now, during your period of time, there were no female undercover officers on the unit, were there?
That's true, I think, yes.
And so it goes to follow that it was a male-dominated environment for the 20 months or so that you were there.
Well, I suppose numerically that's a fair statement to make, yes.
HN 353, who you recalled,
Oh, yes.
Describes there being friendly banter at the meetings. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm sure that there was.
Another officer who joined the SDS shortly after you left has described occasion when the friendly banter would turn to comments on female members of the groups that were infiltrated, or comments on reputation of the officers and on sexual interactions of the officers. Was that a fair description of the banter that took place when you were on the SDS?
No, I wasn't aware of that at all. And you're saying that happened to after my time.
What sort of banter do you recall hearing? Anything that caused you concern?
Well, I'm not aware of anything that did cause me concern, really. And certainly I wouldn't have gone along with the suggestion that that was banter about females.
If you'd have heard such type of banter, would you have dealt with it?
Yes.
The same officer describes that managers would essentially turn a blind eye to such banter at these informal meetings. Would that be fair to you or your superior at your time?
Not in my time, no.
Let's go back to your comment that officers wouldn't necessarily have told their detective inspector what they were doing. If we can have paragraph, the statement is MPS-0747802, and paragraph 117, please. I'm sorry, I don't have a page reference. Mr. Brice, this is your witness statement that's being brought up onto the screen. Thank you. What is it that you thought officers might be keeping from their managers?
What I mean there is this, that because the job was so unique and individual, I wouldn't have an opportunity to challenge, first of all, its authenticity and whether there were any omissions or not. If I was supervising, say, a younger detective on a crime investigation, I could check back on certain things, but because it was undercover, that's not possible from a position that I was holding in SDS. I had to take these things at face value. So when I say that it is possible that some of the things that were done were not reported, I stand by that statement, because I can't prove one way or the other. I can't go out there and find out for myself.
What things are you referring to, Mr. Brice?
Well, I think I'm not quite sure I understand the question, because people don't necessarily tell everybody everything, and certainly in a working environment. That's what I meant by my statement. I have to take it at face value, and there may be things that I wasn't told, of course.
If I can just give you an opportunity to read to yourself paragraph 117 of your statement, which I hope is on your screen.
Oh, yes. Yes, I've read that again.
Thank you. In that paragraph, you're discussing, aren't you, the difference, as you see it, in the moral standards between then and now. Discussing that officers, in your view, this was their day job, they weren't living together with activists. And this is where we have the comment that they would not necessarily have told the detective inspector what they were doing. And it's really then that final part of the sentence that I'm interested in, is that you follow from your comment that they wouldn't necessarily have told you what they were doing, that you were pretty confident they all went home eventually.
Yes, I stand by that because I think life has changed, certainly as it was though then in the early 70s. And what I meant there was that the job certainly wasn't 9 to 5, because I said earlier some of the work took place in the evenings. But I was fairly confident that in that day and age, cohabitation, for example, wasn't common usage. People weren't identified right, left and centre by where they were on their mobile phones. In other words, you took people more on trust. And so what I mean is that maybe life was more simple and straightforward then. And what I mean is that they were, as far as I was concerned, the job they did primarily, I think, was, I would say, evening activity. Most meetings, for example, take place in the evenings. So there would be a tendency to do the work, the undercover work, and then resume some sort of normal life with one's normal family. And what I mean is that, in other words, to go home afterwards and, as far as one can, pick up normal life again. There perhaps was a clearer distinction between the undercover work and ordinary life as it was in those days.
Mr. Brice, was that any reference to the possibility that an officer might be developing a close relationship with a member of the group they were infiltrating, whether it be a friendship or an intimate relationship, one that they wouldn't tell you about, but they would go home from at some point?
Of course, I have to say that is a possibility. But I would just say a possibility. I can't say any more than that because I don't know.
Was it a possibility that was in your mind back in the time you were in the unit?
No, it wasn't. That possibility is only because what I've learned in the national press since about SDS.
Staying on the topic of relationships and reputation, I'm going to return, please, to deal with two officers that we've spoken about, HN 300, who you recalled, and
Yes.
And HN 297, Richard Clark.
Yes.
Please can you bring up document MPS-0724152? And scroll please to page 3. Mr. Brice, this is a memorandum written by Chief Inspector Neal and dated the 31st of May 1974, so when you were still on the unit. The first point I want to deal with, please, is married officers. If you look there, please, at paragraph 2, reference is made to HN 300, indicated a willingness to join. He's a married man who lives with his wife and child. If we then move to paragraph 3, DC Richard Clark, who is HN 297, willing to join. He is a married man, aged 29, with children. So dealing with that point first, if we may. In your witness statement, you recalled that as you gained experience on the unit, you understood that those that were recruiting looked at personal circumstances and that preference was given to a prospective recruit who was married. Is that right?
Yes.
the officers that we've spoken about who were recruited during your time were all married. Was that a policy that you understood to be developed whilst you were on the SDS?
Well, it could have been, yes.
Now, can you explain what you thought the purpose and the advantage was of recruiting a married officer, please?
I think my concern would be primarily that at the end of an operation or a day's work or whatever, they would, by definition, hopefully, return to an established home life. In this case, with their wives and possibly their children. That to me meant there was, it was, in inverts, slightly more stable and safer than the other possibility.
Are you aware whether the families of these officers were made aware of the role that they were expected to play, to be providing that break, that stable home life?
Well, I'm not aware that wives are actually ever interviewed, but I think there was a consideration that must have been given. I was never really involved in the selection of these people that appear on these lists. We never sort of sat down and said, who have we got next? They sort of emerged from somewhere, probably more senior up the scale. Maybe it was a recommendation amongst more senior officers saying this person might be suitable for this type of work. And it would come down the line rather than go up.
And on that point, if an officer arrived to you and your chief inspector that you had a different opinion about, would you be able to challenge their suitability for the unit with your superiors?
Well, I think I would be expected to if I had grounds to do that. And I think I would have a duty to do that as well, if for some reason I felt that that person, after all, wasn't quite suitable for the job. But I don't recall this ever happening.
David Bicknell, in his witness statement, suggested that the reason married men were chosen was it was considered less of a temptation for them to enter into inappropriate relationships with women. Was that also a consideration that you understood at the time?
Well, I didn't say that, but I understand what he's saying. Hopefully I put it in a different way to your earlier question, that I felt it was a safer and more stable place to go to when they'd done their job.
Can I perhaps ask it like this? By mid-74, was there a live issue that there was at least a risk that male officers infiltrating groups would engage in intimate relationships?
Well, I can't answer that question specifically. Of course there was always a risk, but I wasn't aware of that risk during the latter part of my time, or indeed any of my time on SDS. But then how would I have known anyway?
Whether the officers were married or not, the job of the officers were to go into a group, pretend to be single, and to befriend people in that group. Is that right?
I think that's an assumption when you start out in this job, but you say single. I wasn't aware that it ever came up whether a person had to admit they were single or married or whatever, if they were just going to do the routine job. I don't think I can expand on that any further.
Let's move then, please, to just one or two questions. The length of service that David Bicknell, as your superintendent, in his witness statement said that 2 years was the maximum length that he considered an officer should be in the role. The reason being that they didn't forget that they were police officers. Some of the officers in the squad when you joined were on for up to 5 years, so well in excess of that 2-year maximum. Did you have any concerns about long-term deployments and the risks that they carried?
I think Bicknell's statement is a reasonable one. I would have been more concerned about the length of time that they remained, as it were, safe and secure in that job.
Let's go back, please, to HN 300-297.
Yes.
Both of those officers had at some time been on the surveillance unit. Did you know either of them from your connection with that unit?
No, I don't.
If we won't have it back up, the memorandum that I showed you, someone had spoken to them, it seems at the behest of Chief Inspector Neil. Do you recall speaking to either of these officers?
About joining SDS?
Yes.
No.
Can we have up, please, document MPS-0741094? Mr. Brice, what's being put up is an appraisal of HN297. Now, you weren't the person appraising him, but I want to take a look at the view that was taken of him in January 1974. You'll see there that it reads, DC Clark has recently shown remarkable abilities during a period of difficult surveillance work. Among these are an enthusiastic and intelligent use of available intelligence to full advantage and an ability to work extremely well in a team. He shows qualities of leadership under pressure which will fit him well for promotion to sergeant. It's later then that year in the summer that he is brought on to the SDS. The question I'd like to ask you as a result of that, and it can be, Mr. Brice, are you still reading it or?
No, I did read it. I think I got to the end.
Thank you, if that can be taken down. Would an appraisal such as that, what you may consider a glowing appraisal, weigh in the balance of whether to recruit an officer to the SDS?
Yes, I don't see the connection quite between the team leadership that's required for surveillance and as distinct from work on the SDS, because the SDS, until we met together twice weekly, it was very much an individual role they played. So I don't see the connection that one makes it obvious for the other, if that makes sense.
I think what I'm driving at is in the recruitment to the SDS, a closed secret unit, would a reputation, be it good or bad, be important on knowing who should be brought on by those involved in recruiting?
I can't really answer how this process of recruitment started up at all in terms of who discussed what with who. But what I think I said earlier on was that very often the candidate was presented. I don't have any recollection myself of being involved at the very early stages of recommending people, particularly for SDS work.
We'll return to that in a moment. HN 300, an officer who was in the back office, who you recall being on the SDS, would it be fair to say that you would have weekly, if not daily, interaction with that officer?
Well, I would have an interaction with him if he was in the back office, yes. But not that frequently.
HN 300 has been described during evidence to this inquiry as having a reputation for falling in love all over the place. Were you aware from your time in Special Branch, not just the SDS, but the wider Special Branch, of that reputation?
I didn't know this man very well, and I'm not sure, I don't think he was ever properly engaged on SDS operations while I was still there. So I'm not aware of that reputation. And of course, I left the force at the end of, I think, October 74. So I don't know about any reputation that he might have had.
HN 297, who by the time you left in October, that's Richard Clark, if I can assist, had been with the SDS, albeit in the back office, for 3 or 4 months, has been described as having a reputation, again, in Special Branch, not just within the SDS, as being a womanizer, and to the degree that an officer has described him as a carnivore. Were you aware of his reputation?
No, I wasn't.
From your observations of him during that time, did you form any such view?
Well, I don't remember him actually being, certainly not on the squad, or I can't remember him in the back office either.
I just want to come back to the point of who was suitable to be on the squad. I understand what you say, that you had no involvement in recruitment, but you have said that if you were presented with an officer and told this person's coming to join you, and you felt that they just weren't suited, it would be a duty to raise that. What view, if any, would you take if you were presented with an officer who'd had a good reputation for the work product and considered to be a strong and safe pair of hands, was a married officer, an officer with children, so hence a stable home life from your description, but that had a reputation for being a womanizer? Would that cause you to say this person is not suitable to infiltrate groups in an undercover role?
Well, it's not something that happened to me at the time. If I was presented with that situation hitherto, then it would be something I would want to consider, I think, greater. Because clearly there was a big degree of trust involved in deploying these people in this sort of work. I wasn't particularly on the angle of womanizing or whatever, but it was the trust aspect of it which I think is more important. And maybe when a person has that said about them, that would, to me, raise a doubt about perhaps the whole question of integrity.
I appreciate I'm asking you to say what you think you may have done, as opposed to being a situation you were faced with, but would it be a matter of it being a balancing exercise and seeing where the balance fell, or would it be this is concerning, we won't have this sort of person on the SDS?
I find that question very difficult to answer, really. I'm sorry.
Final few topics, Mr. Brice. I hope we can deal with them before the lunch break. I just want to spend a few moments on, as you learned on the job, the views that you developed. You have said in your witness statement that from time to time you would consider how to improve the unit. Can you expand on that a little, please?
How to improve it? I can't think of anything specific in my time, and I'm only speaking from the months or the year and a bit I spent on it. We might have benefited from even a more frequent number of meets. And not that I felt it was wrong at the time. I think what I'm saying here is that that you can't have too many opportunities to meet people who are dealing with difficult work situations, whether they are within a group, as we were in the safe houses, or as individuals. So maybe we could have had more one-to-one situations than we actually did, although people were able to ask for one-to-one situations even when we met together at safe houses. Sometimes things were confidential.
Do you recall now having any one-to-ones?
Do I recall?
Having any one-to-one meetings, that
Yes.
request being made?
Yes.
Again, for the moment, not going into detail, do you recall what the concern was leading to those one-to-one meetings?
People may have had a problem about feeling, for the time being, a bit less secure than they'd been, or they might have had a domestic situation which would cloud their ability to do this difficult work, or they might want to change their cover operation in terms of maybe a job or something like that. So they were the sort of things that we were available to discuss, and they would have been dealt with on a one-to-one situation, yes.
And so if it was a welfare consideration, such as home life, that would be something that you were equipped to deal with yourself, would it?
Well, not just me. I mean, but I was the first port of call in a sense, because I like to feel that in the time I was there, I had developed a trustworthy relationship with each of these officers, not just as a team together, because they didn't work together after all, but as individuals. And basically, there has to be an element of trust there together. And I would have always thought that I was their first line of, not attack, solace in being able to bring that particular piece of worry they might have to notice. And we take it from there.
Would it be fair, some situations you would deal with yourself and others you would refer up to your superiors?
Yes, I mean, that would be judged entirely on its merits. I mean, if it was something that I could easily put right, I mean, yes, of course I would do it. I would sort it out. And if it was something else where I needed further counsel as well, then I would take it further up.
Can I ask you this about intelligence? You've said that you came to understand that if good intelligence was being produced, the officer might run for a bit longer. Did you come to understand what constituted good intelligence?
It's a very difficult question to answer. And it was always a difficult situation to know when to withdraw somebody from this type of work. It wasn't difficult if there was, say, personal problems or something in the welfare front, because that has to take precedence. But in the gathering of intelligence, of course, there is a temptation to keep it going whilst things are looking to be good. I can't quantify that any further at this stage because it's so long ago. It's not an issue really I ever came about, but I can understand you might want to go that extra month or two when, with the benefit of hindsight, you might take somebody back out earlier on. I can't help any further with that.
To your knowledge, would an officer be aware that would they be given feedback so that they were aware if they produced good intelligence, they may get a longer run in the SDS?
No, I don't think that was ever a guarantee or an idea of a guarantee, no. I think the welfare situation was paramount in everybody's mind, because what you didn't want them to be is to be compromised.
Mr. Brice, final topic I'd like to deal with is the move to Esquad in July 1974. I wonder, please, could we have document MPS-0730906? So it's tab 3 of the bundle, at page 3. Mr. Brice, what is on the screen now is one of the annual reports that were produced and the letters that went from those high in Special Branch to the Home Office.
Yes.
To seek the continuation. And this is dated February 1975. Could we scroll down a little bit, please? I'm looking at the final paragraph on that page, and this relates to the move to Esquad. It's a letter by the Assistant Commissioner for Crime, Woods, and it says this. The Commissioner and I have continued to take a close personal interest in the activities of the squad. And I would stress, as I did last year, that each officer involved undertakes that the maintenance of the strictest security remains paramount. Every practical step is taken by close supervision and intelligent anticipation to prevent exposure, and no complacency is permitted. To this end, the operations of the Special Squad were placed in July 1974 directly under day-to-day supervision of a chief superintendent and superintendent who were reallocated from other tasks in order to provide a further degree of control.
Yes.
Now, we've dealt with the fact that you're aware of this move to the additional control of being under Esquad by the arrival of David Bicknell on the SDS as your superintendent. Is that right?
Yes, from my memory, I think Mr. Bicknell became the chief superintendent. So I think that's what I was saying in my statement.
Were you aware of any review that took place on the management level of yourself and the chief inspector that led to the SDS being brought under the control and supervision of Esquad?
I don't see any major difference between the control of it was before it went to Esquad and when it went to Esquad, apart from that slight change in chief superintendent and superintendent. I think that's my answer.
Well, that anticipates my next question. And you said that once David Bicknell was in place, it was a little easier. It was more approachable. Aside from that, did you notice any impact on the day-to-day running of the SDS from July 1974? No,
because I wouldn't have done, because of course I was on the way out. I left I think on fairly early in October or something. So I wasn't aware of that structural difference making a difference day to day. I wasn't exactly on demob leave, but in a sense, I was still dealing with Mr. Bicknell at any rate. He may have been a rank higher, so I didn't have a problem in dealing with him when he was either a superintendent or a chief superintendent. But I think by the time we get to the point in that report, Mr. Neal was in place as well as the chief inspector.
And you said earlier you don't have any real recollection of Derek Neal. By July of 1974 then, were you aware that you were going to leave the police force? I don't need any detail, but just whether you recall.
Yes, I probably was, yes.
two final points to deal with. The description that I've just read out from the letter, would you agree that the supervision on a day-to-day basis and by senior managers was not so much concerned with the standards of undercover officers and a check on the limitations of them trespassing into the lives of individuals, but the concern was to keep the activities of the unit secret and secure? That was the overriding concern.
I think my answer to that is, of course, I never saw that letter because it's until I was shown it as an exhibit not long ago, and nor should I have done. But what I would say is that those comments I would heartily endorse, and I believe that the point they were making about the security of it was as important as what it actually achieved in terms of intelligence. There was certainly a dual role here, and I happen to feel very strongly that, as you'd expect I would, I suppose, that during my time on it, we had a pretty close hand on what was going on in both of those contexts. Is the success of it as far as its gathering of information, and also the fact that it was pretty secure overall. So I would endorse the comments of that senior officer, whoever it was, writing to the Mr. Waddle at the Home Office.
Thank you, Mr. Brice. For now, those are the questions that I have for you. I realise we've arrived at 1 p.m.
Would it be sensible for any questions that you may be requested to pose to be communicated to you over the lunch hour, or do you need longer than that?
I hope over the lunch hour will be
Yes.
sufficient, sir. Thank you.
Then can you be back ready to resume at 2 when I think the final leg of your evidence will be completed?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we'll adjourn until 2.